I would say that the best way to learn editing is to look at other movies and then do your own movies over and over and over again. But I will try to highlight some parts of editing. Rhythm is very important, or pacing, and that the rhythm is of course the length of the shots or the interval between the clip, the cuts. And if you have continuous pace, then you don't have a rhythm, because a rhythm is when you change the pace. And some parts of the movie need to be faster in the editing, while other needs to be slower, of course. And if you really want to convey the impression of speed and hectic editing, then you actually need to have slow parts of the editing also. And that's very obvious in some movies, that you have this hectic editing when there is an action scene. And after this action scene you have this talk or dialogue scene where the characters are talking about something. And that is of course much slower in the editing. Then you have these movies where the editor didn't really get that, and they have constant high pace all the time. And of course what you get, or the result, if you have a constant high pace, is that it tends to be, it loses the energy, so to speak, because you can't have high volume all the time. In order to really give the impression of a high volume, so to speak, or a high speed, you have to contrast it with slowness. And when you are sitting and editing, you can have the impression that you have to make a cut. That is the work that you do when you edit. But as Walter Murch writes in his book, In the Blink of an Eye, he says that you make an editing decision every frame. 25 times a second you make an editing decision. Because when you decide not to edit, not to cut, that is also a decision. So you don't need to feel that you have to cut all the time. But really think, don't cut if you don't need it. Or as it says here in my PowerPoint, dare to hold the shot. Sometimes it can be very effective to have a long shot, because the long shot can be very intensive, and sometimes more intensive than quick editing. One very basic rule of thumb when it comes to editing is to cut in movement. If I make a movement like this, I can cut in the movement, and it feels a little bit more natural. That's a very basic line. In the next slide I will get back to some more thoughts about editing, because there is much more to finding the right cut point. One aspect of editing is that it can compress or prolong time. Let's say that you are going to show a character that moves from his home out to his car and gets into the car and drives away. In real time, that action might take 3 minutes, but in movies you never show the whole sequence. You don't need to show that he is picking up his car keys and then going out the door and so on. It can be compressed very much. So the action of getting up and going down to the car and driving away, that can be told in 5 seconds instead of 3 minutes. At the same time, editing can also make prolong time, and the typical, an obvious example is of course an action scene where you have slow motion, and you have actually you see the same scene, the same action several times, like in an explosion. very often you see the explosion from 2 or 3 different angles and repeatedly, so to drag it out, because in reality an explosion is of course over in just a fraction of a second. But in movies you have to really get the use out of it, so to speak. And also by using slow motion you really put emphasis on it. Parallel actions are very often used in movies, that you cut between 2 different events, and that can be very effective in raising the tension. And of course that is something that you actually plan in the script often, or you might come up with it in editing. You always have to use, you should always use straight cuts. That is, you shouldn't fade in and out all the time between the cuts, but use straight cuts. Because the straight cuts are the convention, especially in drama, in fiction, and quite much in non-fiction and documentaries also. So since a straight cut is a convention, then if you fade in between 2 cuts, two shots, that is something that step aside from what is the normal. So when you make a fade in, that is a signal, a sign to the audience. It might be that you use a fade in to show that what we see is a dream or something like that. And you don't want to make that impression if you don't need that impression. So remember that when you do fades, you always do it of a reason. Otherwise you should use straight cuts. And as I've been saying in the other recordings, the other lectures, you have to create a space-time, so to speak. You have to make clear for the audience where people are standing and so on. And if the character looks in a direction, you have to make sure that the audience understand what the character is looking at. The last thing here is 3 different approaches to editing. Continuity is the normal editing, that everything flows in a seamless rhythm, so to speak. Juxtaposition is when you contrast things against each other, and it's a little bit similar to parallel action, but it also involves a contrast, a kind of tension between two opposites. It might be, for example, that you have one parallel action showing someone that is waking up and preparing to go to work, and then you have another parallel action showing someone that prepares, is preparing himself to make well, maybe he's going to sleep. So you have 2 different actions, one waking up and another one going to sleep, and they are in contrast, in a juxtaposition. And collage is a more poetic assemblage of images. If you think of a typical start of a movie, in some movies you have this start where there's lots of landscape images before you actually get started with what happens in the movie. That is a kind of collage. Images that are not really that related, they are loosely related to each other, but together they still tell some kind of story. For example, if you combine landscape overviews with focus, with close-ups of parts of the landscape, a bird or things like that, then they are quite separate, these images. and you don't really understand. There is no continuity, so you understand where in the landscape is this bird. So in that respect, the images are not directly related to each other, but you combine them in a way, and then you make a collage of more or less related images to tell a kind of poetic part of the story. Okay, this is the 6 rules of editing according to Walter Murch, and I really recommend that you read the book instead of listening to me trying to explain them. But I will try very quickly to explain how I interpret his points here. And this is in falling priority. So the top one is the thing that you should think of primarily when you decide on if you should cut or not. And you notice, for example, that general rule of thumb that we have been talking about before, like the 180-degree rule and so on, they are quite low in priority here. So what Walter Murch says is that the most important part is emotion, to cut according to emotion of the movement. And in that, if that is in conflict with the items further down, then you skip the other ones. You let the emotion take priority over, for example, the 180-degree rule. Okay, so if we start from the top, cutting in emotion is trying to tell the emotion of the movement in the editing. And one example could be the reaction shot. If a girl is breaking up with her boyfriend, the emotion of the movement is his reaction, or might be at least. So then you show his reaction instead of showing her when she is saying it. And the next one is story. That is the quite mechanical telling of the story. Okay, that person is going over to that place here, and then going over there, and then going over there. What people are doing in the movie. And rhythm comes next, that you must think of rhythm. Should it be fast, slow, should we change pace, and so on. And then we have eye trace, and that connects to the match cut that I was talking about in another lecture, that you match things, positions on the screen, you match those. And for example, if I'm sitting looking into the image like this, you as an audience have a tendency to focus in the middle of the image. So you can control where the audience look by compositing and editing. And that is what is meant by eye trace. And 2D on the screen is trying to be consistent with, for example, the 180-degree rule. So that if there is a dialogue and people are standing face to face, then the editing should give the impression of them standing face to face. So that in one shot, one of the characters is looking in that direction, and in the other shot, the other character is looking in that direction. So they face each other. Then the last one is 3D in space, and that is what I've been talking about a couple of times before, that you have to tell the audience about the space. How does people stand in relation to each other? If something happens outside of the image and you cut away to that, you have to give the impression of how far away is this? If there is a car crash, for example, if two characters are standing and talking, and then suddenly you have a car crash, what is the distance to the car crash? Is it 10 meters or 100 meters? That is creating this spatial relationship in the fictive world.